Autopsies on the 4 students found each had multiple stab wounds. Some had defensive wounds, showing they fought with the attacker, and there was no sexual assault. County Coroner Kathy Mabbutt is describing the murders as personal.
Were they found in beds?
Yes. There were multiple stab wounds. The fatal ones were to the chest area or the upper body area.
So Kaylee's injuries were significantly more brutal, but they were sleeping together in Maddie's room. So that helps put the puzzle together.
The father of Xana Kernodle says her wounds show she fought for her life.
Bruises, maybe hurt by the knife or whatever.
Yeah.
She's a tough kid. Whatever she wanted to do, she could do it.
Ethan stayed the night at his girlfriend's house, who was one of 5 girls who lived in the home.
They say his girlfriend, Xana Kernodle, was one of the other victims and that they were in the same room in the house.
From a forensic perspective, traumatic injuries can be divided into 2 categories: blunt trauma and sharp force trauma. Blunt trauma results from an impact with a dull, firm surface or object. Blunt trauma is typically caused by contact with a solid, firm surface, such as the floor or ground, or an object like a fist, bat, or bottle. Blunt trauma injuries include abrasions, bruises, contusions, hematomas, avulsions, fractures, and lacerations. Sharp force trauma describes an injury produced by an instrument with a thin edge or point, i.e. sharp cutting instruments. Sharp force injuries include stab wounds, incised wounds, and chop wounds. So this term, sharp force injury, encompasses essentially these 3 separate but related injury types. Stab wounds or puncture wounds are produced by sharp pointed objects, wherein the direction of force is more perpendicular to the skin surface as opposed to tangential or parallel. In most instances, the wound is deeper than it is long on the skin surface. In contrast, incised wounds or cut wounds are produced by sharp-edged objects, wherein the direction of force is more tangential or parallel to the skin surface as opposed to perpendicular. In most circumstances, the wound is longer on the skin surface than it is deep. Chop wounds can be considered a combination of sharp and blunt force trauma, wherein a relatively bulky object with an edge or a fast-moving object with an edge impacts the body, resulting in injuries that have features of sharp force trauma as well as those of blunt force trauma. Sharp force wound edges are characteristically sharp, clean, unbruised, unabraded, and inverted. There is no tissue bridging, and the injuries tend to be more linear. The deeper tissues are cut cleanly in the same plane. Most fatalities caused by sharp force are homicides. The most frequent cause of death in homicides caused by sharp force is exsanguination because of injuries to major vessels. How fast death will occur depends on the number of vascular hits, the type of vessels affected, and their size. In this context, not only the amount of blood loss, but also the speed of blood loss is a deciding factor. As one might guess, the scene of death in cases due to sharp force injury are frequently extremely bloody, although this is not always the case. Oftentimes, when skin injuries are gaping open, blood freely flows out of the body, resulting in extensive external blood loss. This may be particularly evident in cases with large, gaping, incised wounds. In contrast, in some cases with sharp force injuries, particularly stab wounds, the wound edges remain relatively well approximated and there is extensive internal bleeding but little external blood.
And welcome to this Thursday edition of Banfield. I want to begin with some breaking news on the Idaho murder case. A couple of sources with knowledge of the investigation have told NewsNation some details that up until now we did not know. Let me lay a few of these details out, but I do want to warn you that this is graphic information and it is uncomfortable to hear this because we're talking about innocent kids who were killed in that home back in October. And not only that, this is evidence that likely will come out in court at some point. Whether it will be germane to who the killer is or not, that remains to be seen. But it could be evidence nonetheless. With that in mind, let me let you know what these sources have told NewsNation. Number one, they told us that the victims, Kaylee Gonzalez and Madison Mogan, were killed first, and they confirmed that Ethan Chapin and Xana Kernodle were killed on the second floor afterwards. And these are some of the other details that they have released. They said that Ethan Chapin was killed in the doorway of Xana Kernodle's room before the killer set upon Xana. The sources say that it appeared Ethan had stepped partly into the hallway where the attack may have begun. These sources also say that Ethan Chapin suffered a slash to the neck. But I have to say that both of these details are in direct conflict with what the coroner had originally told us right here on this program exclusively. And also, they conflict directly with what police have said as well. And those two facts that are in conflict are that all of the victims were in their beds, according to police and the coroner. And according to the coroner, all of the injuries were stab wounds and not slash wounds. So I just want to play for you exactly what it was the coroner said in her words. Were any of them slashed? Were any of their necks cut? Or were these all puncture wounds?
Well, it was a pretty large knife, so it's really hard to call them puncture wounds. And they were definitely stabbings.
Can you tell me, when you say that they might have been sleeping, were they found in beds?
Yes.
So those were the facts that the coroner told us. And like I said, it is in direct conflict with what these two sources familiar with the investigation are now telling us as well. That obviously needs to be sorted out and likely best in a court of law as well. Also want to tell you these other details that we have learned from these two sources, that Xana Kernodle put up a fierce fight when the attacker set upon her, repeatedly grabbing the attacker's knife, so much so that she sustained deep cuts to her fingers and that her fingers were nearly severed. Now, that does actually work in comport with what Xana's father had reported to an Arizona news outlet about what he knew.
Father of Xana Kernodle says her wounds show she fought for her life.
Bruises, maybe hurt by the knife or whatever. She's a tough kid. Whatever she wanted to do, she could do it.
Joseph Scott Morgan, I was trying to be as tender as possible with the coroner in asking the nature of this is before we ever knew anything about the nature of the stabbings. And I asked if any of the victims had been slashed. And she seemed to be very clear that these were all stab wounds. But these sources are saying that, Ethan had been slashed, that his neck had been slashed, and that was the original injury he received. I guess the same question for you. Can those two things still be true? Can a coroner consider a slash a stab?
If her assessment was made merely by what she saw at the scene, I'd say, yeah, they could be true. Those two things could be true.
Well, I'll stop you right there. I asked her that. I said, were you present for the autopsies? And she said yes.
No, I said at the scene. If she made that assessment at the scene, just to be very blunt with you, these injuries are going to be encrusted with blood. It's hard to make that assessment at the scene. However, if she went to the post, this would have been easily visualized at that point in time. And not only is the injury to the neck a slash, allegedly, according to this person, but these injuries that you're talking about on the hands, these are going to be incised wounds as well, not necessarily slashes, but this is as a result of grabbing hold of the blade and pulling it through the hand. These are not stab wounds. I can tell you that definitively based upon my experience. So, yeah, there probably are some stab wounds, but that information is, you need more clarity here as to what she's saying. And that's, I guess at the end of the day, it's not really the point. I would draw into question what kind of exam was conducted on site at the scene. I've always wondered, when did she actually get access to the bodies, and how much exposure did she have to the remains that she would have had to have traveled to Spokane to view those posts, because that's where they were done.
Okay, so there's obviously a lot to unpack here, and of course we're not going to take this information as fact because it's an unnamed source. Just because NewsNation platforms it does not mean it's necessarily credible information. That being said, though, I think it would be negligent to just ignore and dismiss this information as speculation. I think it's worth considering and seeing if we can corroborate some of the things that are being reported here. So this first claim that Maddie and Kaylee were killed first seems to check out, at least to me, just based on a number of different items, such as the fact that the sheath was found next to Maddie, whether it was planted or not, the scene upstairs being more controlled and less chaotic, I guess you could say, as the scene downstairs. And when I say downstairs, I mean the second floor. And not only that, but the charging documents, which list Maddie as the first murder victim and Kaylee as the second murder victim. It then lists the charge for Xana and then Ethan. So no, that's not necessarily conclusive evidence as to the order in which they were murdered. It does make sense that the affidavit would be drafted in that manner, with the burglary first and then the order in which the victims died, or that prosecutors believe they died. But again, not a confirmed fact, just something to keep in mind as we make these deductions. With that being said, I've seen it reported a lot, and I think the common opinion or narrative is that Maddie and Kaylee went to sleep in the same bed, which is Maddie's tiny little twin bed tucked up against the wall, which to me just does not make a lot of sense. And I don't think there's anything weird about sleeping in the same bed as your best friend. That's not what I'm getting at. It's the fact that Kaylee's room was right there with a normal size bed, that if they wanted to sleep in the same bed, it would make a lot more sense to me that they would choose to sleep in Kaylee's room. Not only that, but Murphy was in Kaylee's room. There's no, I guess, factual evidence that they went to sleep in the same bed. Nobody's testifying that they went to sleep in the same bed. We saw Brian Enton from NewsNation got this piece of information from Steve Gonsalves, which was a credible piece of information that they were found in the same bed. But he did interpret that to mean that they went to sleep in the same bed.
We've confirmed that they were in Maddie's room, which is also interesting. That's something that we did not know. So Kaylee's injuries were significantly more brutal, but they were sleeping together in Maddie's room. They were sleeping together in Maddie's room.
Which is a huge logical leap, in my opinion. I don't think you can state that someone was killed where they were found. And that will continue to come up as we talk about the crime scene on the second floor. But I do want to take a minute and discuss Maddie and Kaylee's wounds. These wounds are very different than the victims on the second floor's wounds. And this is so critical, and I don't see a lot of people talking about this. Maddie and Kaylee, per the affidavit, are the only two that were found with visible stab wounds. Unless that information was left out of the affidavit, which I don't see why it would be, these are different injury patterns. These could be different perpetrators. These could be different weapons. And we'll get to that when I go into Xana and Ethan. But I want to make it clear that the stab wounds are upstairs. Perhaps Maddie was attacked in her sleep, not giving her the opportunity to respond or engage in any sort of scuffle. And Kaylee may have entered the scene to figure out what was going on. And then she endured a beating of some sort. And that would explain why her injuries are more severe. Of course, that's just speculation, but there's also this statement from Mr. Gonsalves. He says about Maddie and Kaylee, they may have individually died from the exact same thing, being stabbed, but there are more details, he said. They're not even close to matching. This is about Maddie and Kaylee. So it's possible that just based on this information, the very limited information that we have, it's definitely possible that Kaylee sustained more stab wounds and perhaps deeper stab wounds and possibly a beating as well, just based on the limited information we have. But the point I really want to drive home here is Maddie and Kaylee are the only two with stab wounds per the affidavit. So moving on to the claims made about Xana's defensive injuries, this source specifically claims that she put up a, quote, fierce fight and sustained severe injuries to her hands, including her fingers being almost severed as a result of trying to grab the attacker's knife. Definitely disturbing and harrowing, if true. And I am inclined to believe that there is merit to this claim as well, based on the words of her father, as well as Steve Gonsalves, who stated that the coroner told him that Kernodle had defensive wounds after trying to fight off her killer. And he further stated that it was a hell of a battle going on down there, which does support the claims about defensive wounds and putting up a fierce fight. This claim also lines up with the injuries that were briefly described in the affidavit, which state that, quote, Kernodle was deceased with wounds which appeared to have been caused by an edged weapon, end quote. This is very important. Xana's wounds, as described in the affidavit, are not stab or puncture wounds like Maddie and Kaylee's injuries. Incised wounds are produced by sharp-edged objects and typically result in gaping wounds, resulting in extensive external blood loss. And adding in the information from the coroner that the fatal injuries were to the upper body, I think it's reasonable to deduce that Xana died of an incised wound to the throat and unfortunately bled out on the floor. As we look into the claims about Ethan, though, this is where it gets a bit more complex. First, let's start with the injuries. This new claim states that Ethan allegedly suffered a slash to the neck. So first of all, I think a lot of this miscommunication and confusion can be credited to a lack of understanding of the proper terminology for the injuries, as the coroner seems to think that any wound caused by a knife is a stab wound, which is just not the case. And terminology and word choice is critical when it comes to charging documents and other important evidentiary documents and even extrajudicial statements from key figures in the case, like the coroner. And that's probably a big reason that there was a gag order issued in this case in the first place. But what can we gain from the word choice specifically regarding Ethan's injuries as described briefly in the PCA? Quote, Chapin was also deceased with wounds later determined to be caused by sharp force injuries, end quote. Sharp force injuries, as we've discussed, encompasses all three of these wounds: stab, incised, and chop wounds. The affidavit states that Gonsalves and Mogan had visible stab wounds, so their injuries are not in dispute. And we surmised with a reasonable degree of certainty that Xana's wounds are likely predominantly incised wounds, both the defensive wounds on her hands and the probable fatal wound that I speculated would be a throat wound. It's possible that Xana also may have had stab wounds and this information was not included for whatever reason. Maybe it wasn't visible upon entering the scene, as the affidavit is written from the point of view of Corporal Brett Payne. And it's possible that the wounds may more closely resemble each other on autopsy when they're cleaned up. But we're working with the information we've been given, so I'm comfortable saying that Maddie and Kaylee died of stab wounds and Xana's wounds were cut, slash, incised, whatever you want to call it. So if Ethan was killed with an incised wound to the neck, I would expect the affidavit to read that he was found with wounds which appeared to be caused by an edged weapon, as this would describe what is presuming to be both his wounds and Xana's wounds. So the differentiation in the language there is interesting to me. And instead of using that sharp edge weapon terminology, the affiant chooses to introduce this term, sharp force injuries, when referring to Ethan's injuries, even though we know that they all died of sharp force injuries. A stab wound is a sharp force injury. An incised wound is a sharp force injury. So why does he choose to refer to Ethan's wounds like this? Well, he knows the public is going to read the affidavit and dissect it, and the media is going to sensationalize it. So I think part of this is to exclude some gruesome details from public record, and this is pretty normal in a high-profile case. But it definitely has me wondering if Ethan's injuries could not be classified as stab or incised. And that leads me to speculate that he might have died by chop wounds. So let's go over that a little bit. So as we discussed, a chop wound is best considered a combined blunt and sharp force injury that is produced by a relatively sharp object wielded with a tremendous amount of force. The object is often heavy and moving at a high rate of speed, or with significant angular acceleration. Because of the larger amount of force, chop wounds have features of both sharp and blunt force injuries. As such, chop wounds frequently have marginal abrasions and contusions, and sometimes lacerations. Examples of objects that can cause chop wounds include crowbars, claw hammers, tomahawks, axes, hatchets, boat propellers, lawnmower blades, and a multitude of industrial and farm machinery. And this is speculation. I want to make that very, very clear. I'm reading into this affidavit perhaps a bit too much, but there is a discrepancy with how these wounds are being described in the legal document. So I'm addressing that. I'm wondering if these wounds that Ethan sustained are chop wounds, and that's why there's a bit more secrecy surrounding his specific injuries. And being the only male victim, it would make sense that he was perhaps incapacitated with a heavier, duller object than a knife. And if that's the case, then we have a new weapon we're introducing into the scene. So that also may be a reason why they kept that pretty vague within the charging document. So as I'm going through all of this, I remembered a post that Ethan's mom, Stacy Chapin, made on Facebook on January 11th. And it mentions that for an update, anything we/Ethan had is now frozen with the defense. For us, it involves 2 vehicles, E's belongings, and a nice set of golf clubs. So why were golf clubs taken as evidence? So then I asked myself, is a golf club capable of producing sharp force injuries? And I immediately thought of the infamous case of Martha Moxley, who was a 15-year-old girl who was murdered in 1975 in Greenwich, Connecticut. Martha was found beaten and stabbed to death in the backyard of her family's Greenwich, Connecticut home. Investigators traced a trail of blood to the Moxley driveway. There, investigators discovered a piece of the murder weapon, the shaft of a 6-iron golf club. While one man, her neighbor and Kennedy cousin, Michael Skakel, who was also 15 at the time, was eventually arrested, tried, and convicted of her murder. His conviction was later overturned. Martha Moxley had been beaten and stabbed with the Tony Pena golf club. The golf club she was struck with shattered from the force of the blows. But listen to the way these injuries are described. Dr. Henry Lee testified, using his right arm in a chopping motion, Dr. Lee demonstrated how the murderer most likely stood over the victim, repeatedly hitting her with the club. She was probably on the ground receiving some injury, he said. As the killer swung the club back, it had finally broken apart, and the bloodied metal head and 2 sections of the shaft flew more than 100 feet, coming to a rest among dead leaves across the yard. Also, Connecticut Chief Medical Examiner Wayne Carver directed the jury's attention to deep wounds in the girl's head. They were, Carver said, produced by the Tony Pena 6-iron that police say came from a set of clubs owned by the defendant's mother. Carver said the great force of the blows pierced the girl's skull and brain, and that one blow was so sharp and piercing, virtually a stab, that it dragged a lock of her hair through one side of her neck and out the other. As many as 9 blows may have been delivered, said Carver. The assumption I am making, he announced, is that only 1 club was used. So even though her cause of death back in 75 was considered blunt force trauma, I think it's clear that these are sharp force injuries, specifically chop wounds, which does include characteristics of blunt force trauma. But clearly these wounds have characteristics of sharp force injuries. So objects that are used to produce chop wounds are typically heavy or a powerful object that is somewhat sharp to very sharp, or by a sharp object wielded with a tremendous amount of force. The edge of the object creates a sharp force injury, characterized by cutting of the skin and underlying tissues, whereas the intensity of the force or the relative bluntness of the object results in associated abrasions, lacerations, or contusions with or without underlying fractures. A chop wound's appearance may also aid in determining the type of weapon used, as the wounds may take on the pattern of the weapon. So if Ethan's injuries do have elements of blunt trauma, that would make them unique from the other 3 victims, and it would definitely introduce the possibility of 2 separate offenders, 2 separate weapons. This could even be 3 separate weapons used in this attack. Possibly the same weapon upstairs on Maddie and Kaylee, could be a different knife on Xana. If the golf club was at the scene, could have been grabbed in a scuffle or a panic by the offender, or it could have even been grabbed by the victim in an attempt to confront the intruder, right? That could be an object that he grabbed, and then he could have become overpowered in a scuffle, perhaps in the hallway as suggested by the source, maybe not. But if he was overpowered, say by 2 males, one of them could have grabbed the golf club and beat him to death with it. Not to be graphic, but that's a possible scenario that could have happened. This is just something to think about with regards to these injuries. I think it's very interesting, and I think there's a reason we don't have more information on Ethan's injuries. So these new claims have to do with the schematics and locations of the murders. They claim that Ethan was confronted, or an altercation began in the hallway where he may have been overpowered, killed, and then the attacker or attackers turned their attention to Xana. And that makes sense to me. I don't have any evidence to combat that. The one thing that bothers me is the charging documents, and I know that that's not fact, but I don't know. It's just something that sticks with me, because originally I did guess that order, that Xana was last, just based on her having defensive wounds and having to fight. But when I first heard these claims, I got real heated and, kind of like Ashley Banfield, I'm like, wait a minute, this doesn't line up with what we've been told. This doesn't line up with even the affidavit, because the affidavit says, quote, just before this room, which is Xana's room, there was a bathroom door on the south wall of the hallway. As I approached this room, I could see a body, later identified as Kernodle's, laying on the floor. Kernodle was deceased with wounds which appeared to have been caused by an edged weapon. Also in the room was a male, later identified as Ethan Chapin. So because Corporal Payne first came across Xana's body, I'm like, no way Ethan was in the hallway, because he would have seen Ethan's body first. And it does say also in the room. Ethan's body was in the room. And it's presumed that Xana's was too, but just perhaps closer to the hallway than Ethan's was. And then you have the statement from the coroner who says that they were all in beds. And I'm like, what the hell? None of this makes sense. Until I rewatched the segment and pay very close attention to what's being said.
The other details that they have released. They said that Ethan Chapin was killed in the doorway of Xana Kernodle's room before the killer set upon Xana. The sources say that it appeared Ethan had stepped partly into the hallway where the attack may have begun.
And compare that with what the coroner stated.
They might have been sleeping. Were they found in beds?
Yes.
So these new sources aren't saying that Ethan was found in the hallway. They're simply claiming that an altercation started in the hallway and he was maybe killed in the hallway. Again, there's that presumption that you have to be found in the same location that you're killed. And as we covered in my previous video, crime scene staging and cleanup is a thing. If somebody wanted to make this look like a random intruder attack, as we've been led to believe, we have to consider the possibility that the bodies were moved. We know that Xana was at least discovered by Corporal Payne on the floor. It did say that in the affidavit. So we know Maddie and Kaylee definitely in the twin bed. Xana on the floor. Ethan just in the room. We don't know whether he was in the bed or not. But we do have to consider staging a possibility, and that could be why this particular crime scene is so complex, in addition to the contamination. But that's about all I have for you today. I know that this was a lot of information and a lot of speculation and just kind of trying to make sense of the facts and also the non-facts in this case. I really care about this case, and if you're listening to this and following my coverage, you probably do too. So it really does upset me to see leaks and possibly not credible information being presented as fact. There's nothing wrong with speculating. Obviously, this is a true crime channel. That's what we do. But the problem is when it's being presented as fact, that's when the waters get muddied, and ultimately it's a huge disservice to the victims. I understand that these were real people, and my goal is to not indulge in the morbidly curious, gruesome speculation about these poor college kids' deaths. No, not at all. My purpose is to sort through the facts, help us understand how something like this could happen, and maybe get a little closer to the truth and ultimately justice for the victims. I hope this has given you a thing or two to think about, and please let me know about what your impressions of all of this are in the comments below, and I will see you in the next one.